Evening. Glad you all made it through the elevator experience here at the Jewish Center. For those of you I haven't had the honor of meeting, or you're here at MJE for the first time, my name is Rabbi Wildes, and you're in the Manhattan Jewish Experience. We've been having Yom HaShoah programs literally since we began 24 years ago. And I want to thank all of you for coming and showing such honor to the memory of the 6 million. And I want to especially welcome our guest this evening, who I will have the privilege of interviewing in just a few minutes, Mr. Manny Korman, who, by the way, is the great uncle of MJE fellow Shana Korman. Actually, when we first reached out to you, to your brother, we didn't even know about the relationship. We had no idea that the Kormans, a lot of Jewish Kormans. So there are no coincidences in life. You should have a lot of nachas from your...
But these are special Kormans.
Special Kormans. Okay, well, we're going to hear about that in a moment. I also want to recognize the presence this evening of Knesset member Ofir Sofer, who serves as Israel's Minister of Aliyah and Absorption. It's a great kavod, a great honor for us that you've joined us this evening. I also want to welcome the members of Nefesh B'Nefesh, which is an amazing organization that facilitates Aliyah. And we'll hear later on from Minister Sofer, who will close out our program tonight. I want to thank Rabbi Ezra Cohen and Andrew Hershkowitz. He's clapping for himself in the back. Andrew Hershkowitz and Leah Hashimi for all of their hard work. Tonight's program this evening is sponsored in memory of Harry and Terry Panuski of blessed memory, the grandparents of our dear friend Amanda Dreyer-Kalansky, a beloved part of the MJE community. I want to give special thanks to Alan and Alicia Pines, who made this event possible, all in memory of Amanda's grandparents, Harry and Terry Panuski, of blessed memory, both of whom were Holocaust survivors. The Torah in last week's reading records a very difficult incident in the personal life of Aaron, Moses' brother, who was the high priest. And without getting into all the details, tragically, 2 of Aaron's sons were struck down when they were bringing what the Torah refers to as an Eish Zara, as a strange fire, and sort of an unauthorized form of worship. And without getting into all the specifics, what did they do that was so wrong? Did the punishment fit the crime? What we can learn, one of the things we can learn from this episode was Aaron's reaction. What does the Torah tell us about Aaron, Aharon HaKohen, when he learned of the news of the death of his own sons? The Torah says, Vayidom Aharon. Aaron was silent. And this kind of silence is applauded, praised by our rabbis. Rashi, quoting the Midrash, says that Aaron was rewarded for his silent acceptance of God's decree. And when, God forbid, something awful happens, and we're able to somehow accept it and live with it and make our peace with it somehow, it's considered a great, courageous act of faith. And in this sense, silence is indeed a virtue. But there are moments when silence is not a virtue as a response, where it could even be seen as criminal. And I think the greatest example of this, of course, is the Holocaust, which is being commemorated throughout the world tonight and tomorrow. The world may perhaps never forget the 6 million, and that's why we have this event. But we also must never forget the hundreds of millions of people who stood in silence, the dozens of governments and elected officials, Western, European, America, that would not sacrifice military, political, even economic support to save innocent Jewish lives. The quota system in this country, which allowed only a handful of Jews into the United States, which turned back 2 boats filled with Jewish refugees back to Europe, where they ultimately perished. And that is something to think about tonight, too. And we must remember that so that when we witness the next, God forbid, atrocity, that we will learn from history and not remain silent. Now, as most of you know, MJE caters to the 20s, 30s cohort. So obviously we don't have survivors among us. So by definition, we need to turn to our elders. We have to learn about it from others. And if we don't, with the simple passage of time, the historical memory just begins to fade. It's incredible, even as we have survivors alive, we have the Shoah being denied. And you can always read books and visit museums, but there's nothing like meeting somebody and hearing a personal story from someone themselves who was there and somehow miraculously survived. And tonight we are privileged to hear from one such person, our special guest, Mr. Manny Korman. And I just want to, in advance, thank you, Manny, for coming. This is his fourth speaking engagement today. Mr. Korman was born on December 21st, 1931, in Hamburg, Germany. And shortly before his 7th birthday, he and his family were taken from their home by the Nazis and expelled into Poland, where he and his older brother, Gerd, were eventually separated from their parents. And after an incredible series of events, which we're going to speak about in just a moment, Manny, okay, if I call you Manny?
Manny's fine.
Okay, I can't do it. Mr. Korman and his brother found his way to England right as the Second World War was breaking out in 1939. They survived and eventually made it to the United States. Mr. Korman attended Queens College, got married, raised a family, and started an illustrious career in education, including becoming the principal of Adrien Block Junior High School in Flushing, New York. Mr. Korman currently mentors principals around the city in developing their own careers, and it's truly, truly an honor to have Mr. Manny Korman. Please welcome him warmly to our community.
Thank you. I'm a substitute for my brother, who decided that he couldn't make it tonight, actually for medical reasons, but he's fine. So you missed a real treat by not having my brother here today.
We'll see. Thank you for being here and adding us to your many visits today. Let's start from the beginning. Tell us about your life before the war. Where did you grow up? What was your family like?
So my life began in Hamburg, Germany. My father was Polish. He came to Germany, I forget what year, certainly after World War I. And he met my mother, who was born in Elberfeld, Germany, met my mother at a railroad station, and they decided it was okay, and they were married in Elberfeld, Germany, at my mother's parents' house. My father was a shoe salesman, and my mother was a housekeeper, a home person with her children. We lived a very normal life. There was something that occurred in 1933 that made our family's life somewhat different, and that my mother's oldest brother was assassinated in front of his parents' house because he was fighting in an organization fighting the Nazi regime, and they put him in jail and then let him go, and in front of his parents' house, two guys followed him and shot him. So that was March 7th, 1933. And so that was really an eye-opener, not for me, I was all of 2 years old, but certainly for my mother and my father and the rest of the family in terms of what could happen. So that was a normal life. We went to a Jewish day school called Talmud Torah Shul, which was attached to Bornplatz Synagogue, and the chief rabbi of Hamburg was the rabbi, was Joseph Karlebach, the uncle of Shlomo, by the way. And the Karlebachs were all over the place in terms of rabbinical involvement.
They were big rabbis in Germany, the Karlebachs.
Oh, yeah. I think the family originated from Frankfurt, Germany. And Joseph Karlebach, I mean, in Germany, top hat on a Saturday morning as you saw him walking on the street. And Bornplatz was a very big synagogue. It was not a small enterprise. And at Kristallnacht, it was burnt, so destroyed.
And before Kristallnacht, when did you start feeling, obviously you were very young, when did you start feeling anti-Semitism in the air?
You know, as a youngster of 6 years old, I don't really remember the open feeling of anti-Semitism. I do remember, not vividly, but Hitler once came to speak at a soccer field, which was right across the street from where we lived. And everybody was excited about that, and we were told to stay away. My brother and I tried to sneak in. We did. We snuck back out, but I was a kid, you know, so I didn't quite feel the anti-Semitism that we talked about. But that was before we were deported.
Right. So that was in 1938. You were deported?
We were deported October 28, 1938. There was a knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning. My father answered the doorbell. There was a local policeman who was always out on the street, and he said, "You have 20 minutes or a half hour to get your stuff. Each of you can have a little suitcase, and just follow me to the local police station." And we went to the local police station with him, and there we saw other families, and we were put on trucks, and the trucks took us to the Hamburg jail, and they jailed us, the mothers and children in one place, fathers in another place.
And before we get to the jail, did your family, your parents, did they have any kind of warning? Were other Jewish families being taken?
Absolutely, not that I know that anybody had any warning. If we had warning, we wouldn't have been there at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm sure. But there was no warning at all. From what my knowledge says, is that the Polish government, sometime prior to October 28, 1938, had indicated to its citizens living outside of Poland that if they didn't return by a certain date, they would lose their citizenship. So my interpretation says today, the Hitler regime said, well, we can get rid of some Jews in the meantime. They should be sent back. So they picked up all the Polish Jews. 15,000 Jews were involved in that deportation. Now, that was 99% of the world that had no clue as to this deportation. I mean, Kristallnacht was really the big thing that showed its face, and everybody became upset about that. But the 15,000 Jews who were sent to Poland, deported on October 28th, that was if you look at the books, it doesn't say very much about us.
Right. So then you got to prison. How long were you?
Went to prison, was there for the day. Remember October 28, 38, in fact, instead of remember, let me tell you, it was a Friday. So my interpretation of that is the German government also understood it's Erev Shabbos, and let's drive them a little more crazy. And they did a good job of that. So it was October 28th, and they took us, separated us, as I told you, and then we met back at the railroad station. They put us back on trucks, mothers and children, and my father separately, and then we met at the platform of the railroad.
And take us through that. The train.
So there was a train waiting for us, and the windows of the train were open about 3 inches or 4 inches, but sealed the rest of the way. You couldn't move them up or down. We met our father on the platform, and then we had to find our own seats, which we did. Along the way, we met.
And this is you and your...
My mother, my father, my brother, and I.
Okay.
Everybody was on their own as a family looking for seats, and we found our own seats. And along the way, we met somebody, a distant relative, who had a Kiddush cup in his hand. He was making Kiddush for Shabbat on the train leaving Hamburg, Germany. That's a thought process that doesn't leave you so easily. So the train left Hamburg and headed east, made stops along the way. Somewhere along the way, when at one of the stops, my mother, for some reason, had a postcard or a letter that she was able to write to her parents because they lived in Elberfeld, Germany, which is in the area of Munich and north of that. And so she wrote a letter, and she found the guy on a platform and asked him to mail it. She was able to put her hand through that little opening, and he took it. And as the train pulled out, he ripped it into small pieces and threw it away. So that kind of gives you the idea of what the feeling of the times were among the German population vis-a-vis the Jewish world.
And then the train was to Poland.
The train kept going, ended up the next morning at the last town of Germany, which was Neubenchen. And Neubenchen on the German side, Spongin on the Polish side. We had to disembark from the train. My brother reminded me not too long ago that the heads of household, the fathers, were taken. They got off the train, and the German military marched them away from the rest of the crowd. And my brother said, for him, that was a very important time to tell him that my father was no longer in control and that somebody else was in control of our lives. Now, our age difference is 3.5 years, so that's quite significant. So his observations were much more dramatic than mine.
Yeah. And how long were you in Poland for then?
Well, we first we had to get across the border. We were marched to the border. The Germans were in back of us with weapons, and the Poles were on the other side, and they had some rifles they had in their hands. My father told us to stay back, which we did, and then somebody suddenly ran across to the other side, and everybody just followed. No shots that I remembered were fired, and we were on the Polish side. And the Poles had a whole crowd of people here. There were 15,000 people who said hello from Germany. And so the first place they emptied out were horse stables, and they put straw on the floor and they put humans in. So we spent some time in that setting. And then they moved us from the horse stables to...
and who's guarding you this whole time?
Pardon?
Who is guarding you this whole time? Who's
guarding? I have no memory of being guarded, but I'm sure we were.
Right.
The Polish government.
It was Poles? It was...
No, we were past the Germans already. We were on the other side. We were on the Polish side when we were in horse stables. And they then moved us from horse stables to a building called Die Mühle, where they set up cots and mattresses and so on. A little better living than in the horse stables. After a while, my father, who was considered Polish, he was Polish for the Poles. It's interesting. In Germany, we were all Polish because my father was Polish. Once my mother married my father, she was considered Polish, right? And but in Poland, my father was Polish, so not the rest of us. But my father had he was able to leave that setting, and he rented a room in a Scheuchert's house in Spongin. And he was able to move around. And after a while, the Polish government permitted all of us to become a family unit, and my father rented a room on a farm in a little town next to Spongin called Nonia. And so we lived in one big room in Poland. And that was around December, January time. So we lived some kind of life.
So this is like over 2 months, 2 to 3 months now.
Yeah, sure. And then in April of 1939, the German government indicated that all heads of households could return to Germany to take care of their possessions, which were left when they were picked up. Because all we did, the cops came, took us, my parents locked the door, and goodbye. There was an apartment, there was a car in the garage, there were bank accounts, and so on and so forth. So my father and other heads of household were given permission to go back because the German government wanted to get rid of all those unknowns that existed there. And this one owned that apartment, that was locked, so they wanted that cleared up. And so my father went back to Germany, did exactly what he was supposed to do. And while there, he received a permission, a certificate of permission, I don't know the exact title of it, to go to Cuba. And so the discussion then became between my parents, does he go or does he return to Poland? Well, my parents decided that if there's an opportunity to go to Cuba, then go to the States, United States, and then bring the family.
Right.
That was the thought process. And so my father went ahead and he made arrangements. My parents knew a family that were involved in the shipping industry that were not Jewish. And my father was able to acquire a ticket to travel to Cuba. And so in May of 1939, my father got on a ship by the name of the St. Louis.
Oh.
And the history of the St. Louis is a well-known subject in today's world. So the ship left the Hamburg port in May of 1939. It was a regular, nice trip across to Cuba. When they got to Cuba, they wouldn't let the ship in, as most of you know. They wouldn't let the ship in. And then the Cuban government insisted that they leave the harbor area. And the captain of the ship realized that he couldn't take the people back to the European continent. Actually, couldn't take them back to Germany. That would have not worked out well. There were 800 plus passengers on board. This is
all Jewish on the St. Louis, primarily.
I can't guarantee that, but I would tell you mostly Jewish. There were
Mostly
some
from Germany.
There were some who were able to get off the ship because they were from visiting Hamburg and went to Cuba, right? So they were able to get off. There were some people able to get off. The rest of the crowd was not. And so the ship had to leave the Havana harbor, and they moved to a place right nearby called Miami Beach. And so, 60 miles away approximately? So they went into the Miami Beach area, and that was during the time of FDR, and Cordell Hull was his Secretary of State. Yeah. And so they were in American waters. They were told by the American government that they had to leave American waters and they had to go to international waters, which the captain did. And he finally was able to get 4 countries to accept the passengers of the St. Louis: Belgium, France, Holland, and England. And the ship landed in Belgium. That was the landing place. In June of 1939.
What did your father think when he found out that the United States wouldn't accept the refugees on the St. Louis? Did he ever speak about that?
He wrote about it. My brother edited a book many years ago called The Hunter and the Hunted, which is a compilation of reports from different people who survived different things. And he wrote about being on the ship, not being able to come in. And I'm not sure if it was his opening line or some line in the document which talks about not being treated the way people should be treated. And so he ended up, when the ship went back, he ended up in Holland. I don't know how that system was devised of who goes where, but he ended up in Holland. And so that was June of 1939.
So you're without your father for many months now.
Oh, we were without my father from, he left us in April, and we're now talking about June, and he's in Holland. That separation lasted a long, long time.
Right.
So my father's now in Holland.
Was there correspondence? Were you able to?
There was correspondence. Remember, in 39, all the countries were independent. They were not invaded yet. Poland was invaded.
Right, so the mail was still going.
The mail was still going. Sure. And so that's what happened with my father. He ended up in Holland. My mother, my brother, and I are still in Poland. When my father left, we were still in Poland. My mother knew she has to find some way of getting her children out of Poland. And so she found out about what is now known as Kindertransport. When the British government, the parliament decided in 1938, November of 38, that they would accept 10,000 kids from the European continent. No parents, only children, somewhere from the age of 4 to the age of 17. That's approximately the age difference, the age level. And that's what they would accept. And my brother and I were accepted for that program. It was not called Kindertransport at that time.
Right. Was that difficult knowing you'd be separated from your parents? Or that was just...
That's difficult in normal times.
Yeah.
Not abnormal times. I was not easy. When we were supposed to leave, I didn't want to go. I guess you would call me a mama's boy at those times. Right?
How old were you?
I was 7.
Okay, you can be a mama's
boy. I could be a mama's boy, right? And so I climbed a tree. I said, I'm not coming down. My mother, amazing, she had to promise me that she would have a white suit made for my brother and me, so we would look good when we went on the. I came down, right? So did it upset me? Of course.
And Gerd, how was Gerd? Was he support to you?
Oh, he was always my support. Yeah. Without my brother, I would not have made it. I mean, that's for sure. So we went on this Kindertransport. Now, the whole thought of a parent walking their children to a train and saying goodbye to them and not knowing if they'll ever see them again. I mean, that's really what the parents were doing when they were putting their children into those kinds of situations. And
did you have any sense like that? I mean, it would take a tremendous sense of maturity psychologically to understand how heroic that was of your parents, that they loved you more than having you.
I can tell you, I think about that today, and I've thought about it as an adult. I'm not so sure that I thought about that when I was 7.
Sure.
However, if my brother was sitting here answering that question, his answer would be different, I'm sure.
Wow. So you got on the...
So we got on the train. We ended up in Warsaw. That's where the kids were collected. And from Warsaw, they took us to a place in a little town called Adrien, which is known, at that time at least, a vacation place for people of Warsaw. So we were supposed to leave somewhere in July on a Kindertransport. July came and July went. And it wasn't until August 24 or 25, somewhere around that time. Remember that September 1, Hitler declared war on Poland and invaded. So in that time period in Poland at 24, the director of the place, the guy in charge of the 60 kids, indicated that they were ready to send us on the Kindertransport. And one of the requirements, if I'm correct, and I think I am, was that prior to the children being able to go on the Kindertransport, there had to be families in England
To accept them.
who were willing to accept them. And in our case, it had to be Jewish families. And so that's what happened. They did find families. And so when the list was called, I was at the head of the list.
And who arranged for these families?
The organizations. I'm sure that a place like Bloomsbury House, which is similar to HIAS in the United States, and other Jewish organizations were involved in this. I think that was part of the agreement of the Parliament Agreement of 1938. And so we ended up leaving Poland and going back to Warsaw. They put us on trains. We had an interesting experience along the way, and that is we kind of knew this guy, Joseph Camille, who attached himself to us later on. But Joseph Camille's mother was what we used to call in Germany Schwarzfrau.
Can you all hear over there? And maybe just hold it a little closer.
Sure. Joseph came from a family where the family was ultra Orthodox. And when the mother took Joseph to the train, even in Spongy, she was hesitant about putting him on the train because she was so concerned about him not being brought up as an ultra Orthodox Jewish kid that she took him off the train, put him on the train, took him off the train, put him on the train. She finally let him go. But she showed up at the Warsaw Railroad Station to do the same thing. But she finally let him go. But Joseph attached himself to us from the Warsaw Station and further on. So
you met him at the Warsaw Station?
We knew him from Spongy, but only casually.
And he was like around your age?
Exactly my age. Exactly my age. And he was all alone. His mother and his sisters were older, and so he was the only kid going from that family. And so he attached himself to us, especially kid my age, right, his age. The older brother who took care of me, so why not him? And so he attached himself to us. And so we went from Warsaw and went through the city of Danzig with the train. That was the only thing that was Polish, was the station. Everything else was German in those years. And then we headed for Gdynia, which is the port city of Poland. And we boarded the ship called the Warszawa and headed for England. And we arrived in England. And then we were greeted. We were brought to a hall, and we were greeted by the people who said they would accept us into the Kindertransport program, and so they would accept us in London. And so we got there, and my brother and I were assigned to the family, and Joseph was assigned to another family. Joseph cried, and I cried. He ended up going with us
to your family.
To the family.
Oh.
I mean, things.
Yeah. You know, what was the family like?
It was a nice Jewish family. We were registered in the Jewish day school, but we didn't stay long because we arrived toward the end of August. A few days later, war broke out, and a few weeks later, the British government says all school children in London will be evacuated. And so we had to leave that setting, and we were evacuated to a little town called Tallaton, Talaton, which is in the Devon area of England. And we ended up in a very Christian society. And again, the families in that community were involved, they were prepared to receive us and so on and so forth. And but it was all a Christian world. And there were 6 Kindertransport kids among all these kids of London who went to Tel Aviv. The 3 boys and 3 girls. And so when we got to Tel Aviv, my brother and I were assigned to Ruth Gosling and her mother, and who volunteered to take us. Joseph was to go somewhere else. Same routine, same success.
He cried.
Joe came with us.
Right.
And so then we went to school in the 2-room schoolhouse in Tel Aviv.
And this is a Jewish family that took you in as well in Tel Aviv.
Totally Christian.
Totally Christian family.
The whole world at that point was Christian.
Right.
We arrived with a Mr. Cohen, a Jewish teacher. He came with us in the evacuation process. And he used to run Shabbat services to keep the Jewish kids Jewish in some form. Right. It's amazing what we didn't do. We were very careful about kashrut. Well, we didn't eat meat and the whole routine.
The families were okay with that? They didn't...
Well, for a while, but they were amazing. They were absolutely amazing, because a little side story about what this family did was my brother indicated that Pesach was coming. This was for Passover 1940. And this mother and daughter made contact with the Jewish world in London. And we had matzahs were sent, and I guess Haggadot was sent. Wine was not sent. And my brother ran a Seder for the 6 kids.
Wow.
Right. So...
How old was your brother at the time?
He was
10?
At age old 10. All right. But we had gone to Jewish day schools, right?
He knew what to do.
And we had a father and mother who ran some great Seders. So we knew he knew what to do. I just followed suit. So we ended up there. But my mother was still left when we left. She was still in Poland. So the question was, now what happens to her?
Right.
Well,
and where's your father now?
My father's in Holland. Remember, we dropped him off.
Right.
We dropped him off in Holland. Right. We'll come back to him.
Yeah. I don't need these.
So my mother recognized, now that she's got her kids on the way and a husband in Holland, she knew he was in Holland. So she found a way. I don't know the particulars of how she did it, but she got out of Poland. The German government permitted her to return to Germany. She went to see her parents, and she stayed with her parents, and then wrote her uncle, her mother's brother in America, that she needed a visa. And no answer. And so she wrote again, and there was no answer. And we found out recently that, at least I found out recently, it looks like some other people in my family knew about it, which I did not know for some reason, that I thought it was the wife who would tore up the letters. So because they were worried about the financial responsibilities that you take. But it may have been the son-in-law who lived in the same house. Right? There are people like that in this world, as you know.
These are first cousins.
This was
first cousins.
First cousins through marriage. It was the
through
son-in-law.
marriage, right.
There are different kinds of first cousins through marriage. My mother's uncle sent a visa, and then she worked her way to Genoa, Italy. And she was going to visit my father in Holland, and he recommended she not do that, go directly to the United States. And she she went on a United States ship and celebrated Pesach on that ship in April of 1940. That's when she went there.
Where was that ship from? Where did she leave in Europe from?
She left from Genoa, Italy.
Italy, okay.
And ended up in New York. When she came to New York, she was definitely non-English speaking. But she was involved with some relatives, but primarily with, I think it was Hayas at the time. And
Hayas is Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an amazing organization that helped a lot of Jews in the war.
A lot of people. So she got a job working as a housekeeper, full-time, in Great Neck, Long Island.
How many from Great Neck?
And I always say, I now live in Great Neck. I wish I could tell my mother that I live in Great Neck.
Right.
Anyway, so my mother had a full-time job there, and that's what she did. When we arrived, because she did that,
and she knew you guys were okay.
She knew where we were in England. And amazing. She wrote letters and addressed them in a way that nobody would know what was she talking about when she wrote that letter. So we were with this family, this mother and daughter in Teleton. They lived in what was called Rose Cottage. My mother addressed it Miss Cottage, England.
Right.
Miss Cottage, England, came to Rose Cottage. The mailman knew immediately that something Rose goes back with the kids who came from Europe. So there was communication, definite communication. And so my mother knew where we were, of course, and so on and so forth. And then, so my mother was there. And then my brother and I, we got a visit from my mother's younger brother, who was in the British Army, because he left Germany after his brother was killed. He was worried, and the family was worried that something could happen to him as well, even though he was not involved in the same organization as my uncle was. And so he came to England, and to get out of what they call Kitchener camp, which is what they did with immigrants who came from the continent, he could join the army. And so that's what he did. And somebody known as Zali Laufer became John Lawson, because the British were concerned that if he's caught
by the Nazis,
by the Germans, that would be a real problem. And so, to the day he died, he was John Lawson in England. And so, when my uncle left us he came to see us in England, in Devonshire. And then, I don't know how directly involved he was, but visas came then for my brother and me to come to the United States, because my mother was in the United States. She wanted her children. It was not from an ocean travel concept, the greatest idea in the world, to go into a ship and travel to the United States, because the German U-boats were out. And but we did leave on September 1st from London. We left the family in Devonshire. We left Joseph, which was a major concern of my brother, and not so much me, but definitely my brother. But Joseph remained, and my brother and I left. And so we took a ship on September 1st, and we arrived in the United States September 10th. The ship in back of us was sunk. The ship in front of us was sunk. We were not. It's called luck along the way, right? This was all U-boat activity. And so we arrived in the United States September 10, and my mother met us September 10, 1940. And my mother met us at the at the pier. And then,
What was that like?
well, that was amazing. That was amazing because we had now been separated from June of 1939 to September of 1940. And a lot had gone on in between. But to give you an idea about the thinking of a kid my age, the first thing I asked my mother was, did you bring my trains? I used to have a set of trains that ran around the house. Right? Did you bring my trains?
Did
I
she?
mean, that was certainly the most important thing in her life, right?
I'm sure.
Right. So forget that. And so, so now my mother had her children in the United States, except my mother was working full time, 7 days a week, 1 day off. So we lived with families that were really foster families, my brother and I. And my mother continued to work in this household in Great Neck. And then she really got to know a little bit of English in her lifetime. And so she started to study a program for baby nursing. And that was, you visit a house for 2 weeks, you take care of the baby,
Sure,
help them.
baby nursing.
And so she became that. And she rented a room near where we lived in Brooklyn. And so now there was some connection on a regular basis with Mama. Back to my dad, who's not with us. Hitler goes into the lowlands.
Yeah.
And Camp Westerbork becomes a concentration camp. And it's a shipping camp. It's not an extermination camp. And so people such as Anne Frank went through Westerbork. I mean, as far as we know, is all the Jews of Holland went through Camp Westerbork before they were shipped to Auschwitz or wherever. And so my father was there because he came out of the St. Louis. That's part of that crowd. And so people like Anne Frank shipped out for some reason, which I really don't know, nor does my brother know. My father was never shipped out.
From this camp.
From this camp. He had a language talent. My father was a very bright guy. And I can't tell you why they wanted him there, but he was never shipped out. There were other people never shipped out.
Did he have a certain job there that he was
Well,
necessary for?
I don't know that. There's certain things I did not ask, and my brother didn't ask. Because you know when not to ask and when to ask after a while. And so my father survived that. The Canadian Army came into that arena April of 45. Canadian Army freed the camp. And as a side story, which would interest you guys, is that the chaplain, the Jewish chaplain who came with that Canadian Army, is related to the Kormans, Siobhan and Shana. He was an uncle of Siobhan's. So he got to know my dad, and they commiserated. My father and there's correspondence that was very formal between the two. But when Siobhan and Joshua were married, that was stated at the event, and it was one of those unbelievable experiences of a lifetime. So that's
and they met when the Canadians were liberating the camp.
Yeah, sure. So then the question was, when does my father come to the United States? And what happened then was so they were freed April of 45. My father was able to we had to make an arrangement for a phone call with the first to speak to him. So that became June of 45, because in those years, international phones was not what it is today. And so we spoke with my dad on 5 to 10 minutes, whatever it was. And then he came to the United States a year later, a little over a year later, in July of 1946. And he accompanied some hidden children and some other people. And they landed in Mobile, Alabama, and then they took a train to New York. And we met them at the Penn Station in July of 1946. So that's when we became a family again. And so...
Do you go to Penn Station every once in a while?
I go to Penn Station all the time.
Is it like special? Or is it just Penn Station?
At this point of my life?
Right.
It's only special in terms of, why is this train late?
But that must have been how many years? I'm saying you didn't see your dad.
Well, my father left us in April of 1939. We said hello in July of 1946.
Wow.
It's a bit of a time. Yeah. And when you think about a family that's separated for that long, and what are all the pieces of putting that back together again? Not easy. Not easy. I mean, my father found from two little kids, two big kids. My brother was 18, close to 18. I was 14, 15. My father missed both bar mitzvahs of his sons.
Did you have bar mitzvahs?
I absolutely had bar mitzvahs. Yeah, the local synagogue provided instruction for us and so on and so forth. And my brother had the tougher game. He had to read the Sedra completely, and I just had to do
the Haftarah.
Maftia and the Haftarah.
You got off easy.
I got off easy. Yeah, but
did you feel like you were somehow? I mean, I'm just curious, just your thoughts about. You mentioned that the boat in back of you was bombed, the boat in front of you was bombed.
We didn't know that until we arrived in the States.
Right, okay, right. And the kinder transport, you got on that, you found a family, there's a blitzkrieg in London, you got to go to another family, a Christian family, and then you get out, you come to the United States, your mother's alive, thank God, and now you're reunited with your father. I don't even know what I'm asking.
So, I'll tell you what you're asking.
Please.
Manny Korman, were you all screwed up?
No. Oh, well, no, I wasn't.
So let me tell you, I was. You wouldn't have known it just by speaking to me as a kid on the street. But just before my father arrived, I was still biting my nails, sucking my thumb, stuttering. Can you imagine how difficult it is for a guy who likes to talk, to stutter? And wetting my bed. I was 14, 15 years of age. Right. And within some weeks after my father arrived, and we were family structure, all that began to disappear.
Wow.
And so today I'm not doing those things.
I was actually getting a little more of like, sort of the God element. How much do you feel Hashem, God, was part of this? Is it just luck? Is it just like, and you could share whatever you know.
Oh, I'm very straight ahead, as you can tell. I don't believe that we can say it was Hashem. I do believe that a lot of luck was here. I mean, there was work done by my parents in terms of getting the kids into kinder transport or making arrangements this way. I mean, going on to St. Louis was certainly not, the results of going on to St. Louis was not a very successful Hashem activity, right?
Right.
So, but he ended up in Holland. So had he ended up back in Germany, what would have happened, right? We don't know that. We do know that he didn't go back to Germany, thank God. So for me, it's tremendous amount of luck, but also intelligent moves by my parents. For example, putting your children on a Kindertransport was a brilliant move by my mother.
There weren't attempts by so many other Jews to do the same?
I'm not sure about that, but let us say they were. But my mother found out about it. She pursued it, and she made sure in some way that she could get her kids on that. And she accomplished that. Now, that's not luck. That's perseverance.
Sure.
But other than that we weren't torpedoed in the middle of the Atlantic, that to me is luck. The ship was not there when the U-boat was there. But I want you to know I'm a shul goer, so
no,
it's not something I don't do.
Well, you don't pray to the God of luck. I mean, wow.
You had some other questions.
I had, yeah, I don't remember what they are anymore. I will ask you just this. You've been a middle school principal in Queens.
Junior high.
Right. I was
The real junior high.
from Forest Hills, Queens, by the way.
You in Forest Hills?
Yeah, my mom went to Forest Hills High.
And to Halsey Junior High?
Yeah, I didn't. I went to yeshivas.
Oh, you went to yeshiva. Okay.
Yeah,
you went to Forest Hills.
Yeah. And many of your students may have.
When Groveman was the principal, most probably.
I heard. Do you speak about this a lot to your students over the years?
When I was on active duty, I never spoke about my experience. I was very professional. That doesn't mean talking about it is unprofessional, but I just did not think that my role as a principal or as a teacher was to talk about my personal life and give a historical perspective and make a big deal of things that a school didn't deserve to have to live with. Now I do a lot of talking.
That's beautiful. Well, we thank you for being here. One last question. Anti-Semitism seems to be on the rise. Any thoughts? You think we're handling it well? We're not handling it well? We have some dignitaries from Israel here too.
I'm aware of that.
Know.
I'm aware of that. Anti-anything, in terms of human to human, indicates that things are not being handled well. And I'm not implying here that it's the role of the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England to solve this problem all by themselves. But this is a humanity problem, because we have anti-Semitism, but we have a tremendous number of other antis which run through societies all over the world. I don't know how to solve that, but I'm not asked to begin with, so that's one thing. But the whole concept, after going through what my family went through, which was an anti-Semitic event, purely anti-Jewish that the German government was doing, which people call genocide, right? And we're still talking about the same thing. I don't think it's ever going to go away, the antis, because the story about anti-Semitism is centuries old. My brother would give you a better historical perspective than I can give you, but it's there, and it's staring us in the face. But we have to answer to that. We can't be hesitant. I don't think we can be hesitant in saying, being silent. Silence doesn't help us at all. And the problems of many colleges is our kids may be too silent. I'm not there, so I don't know. But I worry about that.
And what would you say to a lot of amazing young Jewish people who just are not finding, I don't know, their own place in Judaism, and we're kind of losing them? You know, you went through so much to survive as a Jew. What would you say to such a, you know, a young Jewish person who
That's why I'm not in the rabbinate.
I'm looking for advice here, you know. It's not simple.
I always
I mean,
wonder.
you love, you're a shul goer.
I can tell you,
sweet smirk when you talk about your Jewish.
Yeah, if I'm not in shul for 2 or 3 weeks in a row, there's something missing in my life, so I have to go back to shul. Part of that, a good part of that, is what happened in my household after my father came and we became a family again. And Friday nights I couldn't go out and play with the kids anymore, right? Because we were living in foster homes, so they let me go. Daddy came, and we had to study a portion of the week every so, right? So my father was a Talmid Chacham, so he was.
You know, you mentioned Rabbi Karlbach.
Yeah.
So the Upper West Side Rabbi Karlbach, Shlomo, he said in one of his books, he asked, how is it that there were Jews, survivors after the war, that went right back to keeping Shabbos, right back to keeping kosher, and there were Jews that didn't want to have anything left to do with it. And he said it had everything to do with the kind of life Jewishly they had before the war.
True.
Because if a kid, he said, loved Shabbos, it was time with his family, and was singing and was joyous, and they missed it, they wanted to get back to it. But if Shabbos was no, and it was this, and it was just, you know, negative to begin with, then who wants this anymore, especially after the Nazis?
So that's interesting. And so in my household, when my father came to the United States and we established a household, Pesach, other survivors who were with my father, who were not religious at all, came for Pesach. And they expected to be there for Pesach as long as my parents could function that way. So for them, who had come from non-observant households, there was a real draw. They never refused about coming to a Seder at my parents' house. And so other Yom Tovim as well. And so there was something that drew them. But in their own homes, there was not a Jewish life. So it's the background.
Yeah.
Background has a lot to do with it.
Sure.
And I mean, that's true today in all of our society.
Yeah. But we can change our backgrounds going forward.
Well, we can do that. We can do that.
A lot of people are, thank God.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's like asking you, well, why'd you become a rabbi?
Yeah.
Right? We won't go into that.
I want to thank you so much for answering all these questions. You're incredible.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's such an honor for us. If there's anything else you would like to
So
share.
I just want you to know that this is a fascinating audience. I spent today talking about Shoah, of experience. At 11 o'clock this morning, I spoke to a group of fourth graders on Zoom in Miami Beach. And of course, the way you present to fourth graders who are 10 years old is different from what we did here today. I then did a presentation at St. John's University. And priests were present at this event and asked some wonderful questions and were very involved in getting to know more about situations like mine or others were much more severe than mine. So that was my second one. My third one was just before I came here, was at Touro College in Brooklyn. So I've been traveling a little bit. And it was the leadership of my union which is the Council of School Supervisors and Administrators in the city of New York. I mean, I'm retired. I'm just a retiree in that crowd, but I was very active in that organization. The Jewish population in the education world has dropped substantially. In New York City, has dropped substantially. But there's a group of young Jewish people who are supervised in the city of New York who decided it's time to have another organization with a Jewish moniker. And so they started the group just recently, Association of Jewish Administrators in the New York City school system. And so they are up to 70 some odd members. And since it was held at Touro College, they brought in classes from Touro College for this event. So the numbers were not quite as large as this, but quite large. So St. John's was large, Touro was large, and this is large. So people are interested, and they want to know more about it. And people such as I have a responsibility of making that happen. I'm sorry you missed my brother. He's a fascinating speaker and speaks from a different perspective than I do. And but he's the intellect of the family. So
Thank you for being with us. Really, it's such a pleasure. Of the Israeli Parliament, Knesset Ofir Sofer, who serves as Israel's Ministry of Aliyah and of Absorption. Again, I want to welcome all the good people of Nefesh B'Nefesh that are here. Before entering politics, Minister Sofer was an officer in the Haruv Regiment of the IDF, received the Major's Citation for bravery and action during battle. It is an incredible honor, and I think so appropriate to conclude our program tonight with a word from a great leader in Israel who agreed to share a couple of words. Close our program, Mr. Minister.
Dear Manny Korman, thank you for sharing your story. Rabbi Wildes, dear friends, thank you very much for being gathered here today. It's an honor to join you on this very solemn occasion. And I'm deeply moved to be here on the day that we in Israel and the Jewish communities around the world remember the tragedy of the Holocaust. We remember the 6 million men, women, and children slaughtered by the Nazis and their collaborators. We also mark 80 years to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And King David in Tehillim says that the days of our life are 70 years. And if we have courage and strength, 80 years. And this number, 80, reminds me of the survivors. Their story, their suffering, and their courage. It reminds me of our duty to remember their testimony and pass on their message. 25 years ago, as a young commander in the Israeli army, I met Nissan Degani, who was involved in the Haganah's efforts to help Holocaust survivors reach Israel after the war. He gave me a copy of his book, Exodus Calling, and wrote, "Look at the things that ordinary people can do. If they can do them, so can you. His words and the stories of the survivors, story of the Holocaust survivors who rebuilt their lives in Israel, in the United States, and around the world, stayed with me as a combat officer in difficult moments. They stay with me today as the Minister of Aliyah and Integration of the State of Israel. It is the weight of their legacy and courage which gives us the desire to build and defend the Jewish state. Today, 8 decades after the Holocaust, we see a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. I see it today, I saw it today, on campus, on the streets, and in the public arena. We see growing Holocaust denial. We see terror attacks and hate crimes against Jews in Israel and across the globe. And we see a radical Iranian regime that calls for the destruction of the Jewish state while seeking nuclear weapons. We must speak out. We must educate and take action against anti-Semitism everywhere, in all its forms. This is our duty, both to the survivors and to our children. Thank you for all that you are doing to preserve the memories of the victims and the testimony of the survivors. Thank you for inspiring the next generation with their stories and courage. May the memories of all those who died in the Shoah be a blessing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Please sing Hatikvah. Is that okay? I'm going to ask everyone to please rise. I think the best way to conclude is to sing Hatikvah, which was a song that was already sung at the end in the camps. And it means hope. And I don't have a great voice, so please sing along. Tonight, Yom HaShoah next Tuesday night. Anyone interested in coming to Israel? MJE is going, we're bringing 2 groups of fellows. And anyone else interested in coming on the heritage trip, you can speak to Aliyah, to Rabbi Ezra, to myself. Thank you all for being here. Please enjoy some refreshments in the other room across the hall.